It's time for the Douglas Coleman Show. Mr. Smooth and Savvy is joined by guests from all walks of life, from the entertainment industry to authors to political and social commentators, the famous and not so famous, the controversial and the light and fluffy. We have it all. Now, here's Douglas Coleman.
Okay, please welcome to the Douglas Coleman Show, Russell Heath. Hi, Russell. How are you?
Hey, Doug. I'm quite well. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it. Why don't you just give us a little bit of your backstory, and then we can talk about your book. I know you're promoting a book called Rinn's Crossing, but
Yes.
give us your backstory first.
So the backstory is I grew up in the suburbs outside of Philadelphia and couldn't stand them and left as soon as I could. I hitchhiked to Alaska, lived in a little log cabin on the banks of the Tanana River, and then did lots of other things. I sailed around the world. I've written novels, and I run a couple of environmental groups in Alaska. And it was really in Rinn's Crossing that I wanted to kind of focus everything I knew about Alaska into a good story. So that's how Rinn's Crossing came about.
Okay. Give us a little more detail on your life in Alaska. That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, I love Alaska. Alaska's this extraordinary place that just kind of scours your soul. It's just beautiful beyond compare. And of course, it's a challenge to live there. So I lived in that cabin, and then the next year I worked on the Alaska pipeline. So I was up all the way up to Prudhoe Bay, but worked all up and down the pipeline north of the Yukon River. And that gave me enough money to travel for a couple years around the world. So I left Alaska, I lived in Italy for a while. Then I dropped down to Africa, across the Sahara Desert, and then through the jungles of Central Africa, and then down into the savannas of East Africa. And then later that year, up through Eastern Africa, through Sudan and Egypt. And then another year traveling through Asia. And I got back to the United States in the early 80s and went back to Alaska and became a computer programmer. That was my kind of survival skill. I needed some kind of job that would pay the bills while I went off and did other things. And so I decided to become a programmer. And about 4 years later, I bought a boat and sailed her around the world. And it was a small 25-foot wooden boat built to a beautiful British design. It was designed in the 1930s. This tiny little boat was designed to be robust enough to go offshore. And when I left, I'd almost never sailed before. I didn't know how to take in a reef. I didn't know how to set anchor. I didn't know how to navigate, didn't know anything. So I just launched myself into the Gulf of Alaska and sailed down the coast all the way to Ecuador, then down to Pitcairn Island, and then across the Pacific to Australia, where I worked. I arrived in Australia, I had $49 left. But I got a job there programming, and then 6 months later, up across Australia, across the Indian Ocean, up the Red Sea, and back across the Atlantic. So it was 37,000 miles in 4 years. And when I got back to Alaska, I ran the Alaska Environmental Lobby, so I got close to Alaska's politics. I really got to know how Alaska functions at a political level. And then later, I ran the Southeast Alaska Conservation Council, and it's a large environmental group its mission is to protect the Tongass Forest, which is America's largest national forest. And it's that forest, which is the southeastern part of Alaska. It's the largest remaining temperate rainforest in the world, a place of just unspeakable beauty and biological richness. And then after doing that, I realized that my leadership there is, let me say this a different way, that I could only take that organization as far as I was personally developed as a leader. And to be a more effective leader, I left Alaska and moved to New York City, where I really jumped into leadership coaching. So as a client, I was involved in many different leadership training and coaching programs. And out of that, eventually became a leadership coach myself, which is now what I do for my living. Is I work with people both in the nonprofit and for-profit world who want to be better leaders, who really want to make a difference for themselves or for their communities.
I don't want to discredit or speak poorly of that particular profession, but why are there so many? Because I get bombarded with people who are leadership coaches, leadership speakers for this show. Is there that big of a market for it? Because it really makes me sort of wonder, are people in this country just that poor at being leaders who are running the country or the corporations? Or, why is there such a big niche for this?
Well, you're asking several questions there, and those are really good questions. So the first question is, why are there so many? I don't know. However, what I would say is a good leadership coach can make a tremendous difference to a leader. And yes, leadership is very difficult. It's very different. It's a very different, I won't say profession, but it's a very different way of being than, say, a manager. So a manager is worried about inputs, processes, and outputs. How do you make something from these resources, and how do you do it really efficiently? A leader, his job is or her job is to point to the horizon and say, this is where we're going. This is the place we've got to go. And how to inspire people, how to talk to people in such a way that they see a possibility for themselves in that vision that the leader has, and then how to get that person into action. A leader is must be much more attuned to relationship than processes and systems like a manager is. And that is not something that's learned. That's not something that you're born with. That's something that's learned. And it's really, really difficult to be a good leader. And, within the business community, one of the cliches, which has a lot of truth in it, is that American corporations, American businesses are well managed and poorly led. And then you can look at some of our political leaders and, really ask yourself if there's a really good leadership there or not. Does that answer your question, Douglas?
Yeah, it does. It does, but it also raises other questions as well.
Excellent.
Because, we could get into the specifics of what makes a good leader, and I don't think there is one cut and dry answer to that. I know from my experience that the best ones are the ones that are really good listeners. I think that is one of the fundamental qualities that is required. And I'm also wondering why, I suppose, that corporations have been able to make huge profits and had really poor leadership. Because that tends to make me think that the leadership isn't a necessity for the bottom line.
Well, you might want to ask, how long does a corporation make good profits? What is the average life expectancy of a corporation? And you find it's only about 35 years. So none of the original corporations that were on, say, the Dow Jones list of industrials is still there.
That's true.
A lot of them don't even exist.
Right.
So the leadership often comes in the entrepreneur. So the entrepreneur has this great idea, right, and turns it into a company, and then the entrepreneur has trouble managing the company because there's, again, two different functions, the entrepreneurial function and the management function. And the managers take over, and they often run the place into the ground. And, a good example is what happened with Boeing. If you look at Boeing and the Supermax, those were taken over by managers and not leaders. And of course they were financially focused, so they wanted a quick buck. And it cost their company billions and billions of dollars and, almost 400 lives. So I would question the evidence that you're presenting me.
Oh, well, okay. I'm going to suggest that you're correct in that, perhaps the corporations that are making profit, it was a definite period of time. And I think at some point, they had to completely retool. But it's not to suggest that the company can't make a profit for a certain amount of time with poor leadership. Because the product, I think, is strong enough that it supersedes a bad leader.
Well, there are a number of different things that you want from a leader. And so one is, of course, the vision, right? You think of Microsoft, who back in the 90s, where Bill Gates was going off in one direction and his staff came to him and said, hey, look, this internet thing is really big. And overnight, Gates completely switched the focus of Microsoft from wherever he was headed to the internet. So he saved the company, so it didn't turn into like another Blockbuster, who, the Blockbuster knew that streaming was going to be the next step, but the leadership was so weak that Blockbuster couldn't adapt, whereas Netflix adapted, went from its mailing CDs around to the streaming, so now it's a major player.
Right.
So, there's a difference in that. But another thing you want from a leader is the culture. Do you want a company that comes and values its employees, that develops a culture where people enjoy coming to work, or where creativity is nurtured? And often a manager who's more focused on processes and not on relationships doesn't get that. And so you can have a company that's making money, but if you look below the surface, people are unhappy and they're leaving the company, and you're losing your creativity, your creativity, and you're losing your future capital.
Let's take Steve Jobs as an example. What is your opinion of him? Was he a good leader?
How do we judge a leader? And what I judge is results, because you're right. There are different kinds of leaders for different circumstances and for different companies, right? And so clearly, he, if you look at the results that he produced in Apple, they're pretty extraordinary. One time, I don't know if it still is, it was the most highly valued company on the planet. So, highly capitalized. So, by judging by those results, yes, he was a great leader. And we'll see what happens in the future, because, Apple really has only one product, and that's the iPhone. And at some point, that produces the vast majority of their profits. And at some point, they may fall.
Well, it's been up and down. I mean, I can remember when Apple stock was worthless at a certain point, and it was right at the point where they fired him, basically. And
Tim Cook came in.
Yeah. So there was that company certainly had a roller coaster ride, but Steve Jobs to me has always been the quintessential visionary. I think the guy was probably an extraordinary visionary, extraordinarily creative, but I think as an actual manager, he was awful. And I think he was the classic sort of like artist who really needed, somebody with the left brain sense, because he was completely right-brained.
Yeah. So coming back to coaching for a minute, which is a ways away from Rinn's Crossing, most of the coaching I do is, I call it personal leadership. Because people often don't have a vision for themselves. They don't know how to be inspired and how to get themselves out of the grayness of their life or the routineness of their life. And I think that bringing leadership to your own life is a critical capability that we need to build into ourselves.
Well, it sounds like you've sort of blended self-help with leadership, yeah?
Well, I suppose. Self-help or personal development.
Yeah.
That's
not a bad
the most
idea.
complicated, the most complicated instrument that we ever have to deal with is our brain, and being able to master your brain and the capabilities that provide you leads for a much richer and more fulfilling life than if you're kind of a victim of it.
We're kind of running out of time here. Give us a quick synopsis of Rinn's Crossing, and then give us your website where people can find it and check you out.
Yeah, great. So Rinn's Crossing has two key interrelated plots. So on the one hand, there's this mountain man who's a classic Alaskan who is so devastated by what's happening on the Tongass National Forest that he goes and sabotages a logging camp. And his ex-lover is charged with that crime and a murder that happened on the same night. So his dilemma, this is a thriller, his struggle is how to get the charges against her dropped without getting accused himself of both his own crime and the murder that happened that night. And then his ex-lover is the environmental lobbyist in the Alaska State Legislature. And this massive package of bills has been introduced into the legislature, some of which she supports and some of which she opposes. But to kill the bills that she opposes, she has to stop those bills that she supports. So she's got a moral and ethical dilemma. And these bills all relate to a number of different things that are critical to Alaskan life, but most notably, a amendment to the state constitution that would protect Alaska Native subsistence rights. And subsistence is a word we use in Alaska to refer to those resources that the natives used or took from the land to support themselves. So the moose, caribou, blueberries, salmonberries, fish, all those things that they supported from themselves. And this was promised to them when their Aboriginal land claims are settled in 1971. And this promise has never been fulfilled in Alaska. So those two plots tie together four main characters, and those four characters are each fighting for a vision, their separate vision for Alaska. And in fighting for those visions, all four of them step over the line and commit crimes. So that, in a nutshell, is the story.
Okay, great. The book is out and available now?
It is, yes. You can get it wherever books are sold, and please support your local bookseller if you got one down the street. And my website is russellheathauthor.com. You can find more about it there, and it's been a finalist for a number of awards, and Kirkus Reviews just listed it as one of the best thrillers of 2020.
Super. Well, Russell, thanks so much for coming on and sharing with us, sharing your very interesting life, it sounds like. Best of luck with your book and all of your other endeavors.
Hey, thanks so much, Doug.
You're listening to Mr. Smooth and Savvy right here on the Douglas Coleman Show. We'll be right back after these commercial messages.
DJC Music and DJC Productions are pleased to announce a brand new website. We have started a listing website for radio show hosts as well as potential show guests. This is a meeting site where hosts and guests can come together. Show hosts can list their show and types of guests they're interested in booking. Potential guests can list their talents, bio, accomplishments, or anything they feel makes them an interesting radio show guest. There are no recurrent payments, only a one-time $5 listing fee. Your listing will stay up until you decide to cancel. Previous guests of The Douglas Coleman Show are welcome to submit their guest listing free of charge. Go to radiohostsandguests.com. That's radiohostsandguests.com.
Love coffee, huh? But wait a minute. It seems like every time you finish a cup of coffee, you get all of these side effects along with it. Heartburn, indigestion, upset stomach, acid reflux. As the world's first and only organic acid-free coffee, Tyler's Coffee is able to provide a healthier option in the solution for more than 100 million individuals who have sensitive stomachs or suffer from acid-related modalities. This is Tyler's acid-free coffee. Coffee without the consequences.
Hi, this is John Morgan, production supervisor for DJC Productions. You're listening to The Douglas Coleman Show.
Okay, please welcome to The Douglas Coleman Show, C.P. Hoff. Hi, Connie, how are you?
Hi, Douglas, how are you?
I'm doing good. Fine, thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
I'm thrilled to be here. I've never done this before, and so I'm a little bit intimidated.
Oh, well, please don't be. It's just going to be a conversation. I said don't be intimidated. It's just going to be like a conversation. That's all it is.
Okay.
So the first question is, let's see, you're from Canada, southern Alberta, is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. You lived there all your life?
No, we moved around a lot. I've lived in Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta.
Oh, okay. Why don't you just give us a little bit of your backstory, and then I know you've got a book to promote. Your book is called West of Ireland. But just tell us your story, you know, you grew up and how you got started writing, things like that.
Okay. I was born in Saskatchewan. We moved around a bit growing up, so I lived all over Saskatchewan. Lived in Thompson, Manitoba. It was a mining community, and then we came back to Saskatchewan for a while before we moved to Alberta. So I've gone to several different schools, you know, made a little bit of a gypsy life there. But then I started writing. I started writing in my mid-20s. There was a tragedy in my life, and after that, I started writing because it just helped me work my way through it. And then that kind of brings me, I guess, to today.
Okay. What are some of the people, who are some of the people that you like? Authors that you read?
As writers?
Yeah.
Oh, I made a list because I thought you'd ask me that question. And I thought, I'm going to go blank when I start talking. Okay. Louise Penny, have you heard of her?
No.
She's a Canadian writer. She lives in Quebec, and she writes cozy mysteries. I find her amazing. I think the reason I like her so much is because her books are more than mysteries. She adds a lot of poetry and dissects the poetry so you better understand it and how it relates to human existence. And there's so many times when I'm reading her books when she writes something that really makes me think about my own life. In one of her books, one of her characters is asked, what is her biggest fear? And she says her biggest fear was to not recognize paradise when she was living in it. And I think of my own life, and I think it's pretty good, and you can find your reasons to complain, but I think when you have a life that, a billion people on the planet would trade you places for, I think you're kind of living in paradise, or maybe sometimes that's hard to remember.
Well, I think that's a good point. I think that people often are unable to see what's right in front of them, and they're always looking to the future. And most people they're always pursuing something. It's always like, well, I just want to do this, or I just want to do that. And on the one hand, it's kind of a paradox, because on the one hand, you need something to drive you, because if you're too complacent in your present situation, there'd be no reason to do anything. But on the other hand, being so obsessed with moving and doing something else and looking to the future and building, people tend to forget the things that are good right here, right in front of them. So I think it's a bit of a balancing act. Wouldn't you agree?
It is a balancing act. And it's sometimes easier to see how to balance it when you're further away from it than when you're close up, and then you have regrets, right? Because you miss chunks of your life that you should have celebrated because you're waiting for what's around the corner.
Well, I agree. I think that, it's harder to see the storm when you're right in the middle of it. Is probably another way to put it. But who do you go to that? I mean, who is a good judge of your situation? And do you ask your friends, or do you just have a general feeling that, in other words, to try to self-assess your life? Where do you go for that image, for the proper image that isn't skewed by your own personal involvement in it?
It's hard because you skew things. When people say things to them, you can skew them to fit your own, what you want to hear, right? You see it all over, how people watch the same thing. A news story, and one side will see it one way and another side will see it the opposite, and you don't understand where the disconnect was. So you just, sometimes you have to be careful. You have to be careful what you look for, and to try to find that honesty. I think I like to read. You find authors that inspire you and push you to think beyond your small shell and think outside yourself and see somebody else's perspective. I think sometimes when you look at someone else's life and what they've survived and how they've survived it, it can give you some insight to your own life. I'm not sure if I'm talking around.
No, I understand what you're saying. It brings me to another question, though. Do you think that books and reading is better for that, what you're talking about, than like a film?
I think when you do books, I think films, depending on the film, some films are so very powerful that they lead you for the rest of your life, like Sophie's Choice, and there's some films that you can only watch once because they were so painful to watch the first time. You just can't. You're glad you watched them, but you can't bear to do it a second time. But I think sometimes with books, you can pause and you can reread things and you can think about them before you move on, so that more of the points stick in than when you watch a film. You can be distracted by the scenery and some other things that are going on, but I think with books, there's less distractions, less things pulling at you, I think.
Well, I agree. And also I think that in a film, the point, if you will, is pretty well hammered in to the film. Where in books, there's a little bit more wiggle room for the reader's interpretation or the reader's imagination. If somebody, for example, in a book is describing a house or a scene or something, you might envision it in your mind differently than somebody else. But in a film, it's right there, and there's really no debate about it.
Yeah, that's true. Often when you've read a book and then you see the film, you think, well, that's not what they look like. That's not.
Exactly.
That's not how you
exactly. Yeah. That's not how you envisioned it.
No.
Right. And you could read, like I said, 10 people could read the description and have 10 different images in their head of what they thought it looked like.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, let's talk about your book. Your book's called West of Ireland. Why don't you give us a synopsis of the book, if you would, please?
The book is about an Irish family, a Canadian-Irish family, that the mother has promised a daughter to the church. This would be just prior to World War One. A daughter to the church. She just was newlywed. She thought she'd have this large Catholic family, and that one of her children could enter the church. But all of her children die soon after birth or before they're stillborn, and she only has one living child. And when her sister-in-law, who is a nun, comes to claim her surviving child, it's what the family does to keep their daughter out of the church. And the fight between the sister-in-law and the two sister-in-laws.
Okay, why do they want to keep her out of the church? Or would that spoil the book?
Why would they want to? Because they want to have grandchildren, because they want the family name to go on. They have one child. They don't want her to become a nun. They want her to have a different life.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. They want their family to go on. They don't want it to end with their daughter.
I got you. Okay. Well, that sounds interesting. Yeah. You've also got another book called A Town Called
Forget, yeah.
Forget, right? Mm-hmm. And that one was your first book. So this one is your second book, presumably, right?
It is.
All right.
Yes.
You want to tell us a little about the other book?
A Town Called Forget is about a young girl who's sent to stay with her aunt for the summer, her crazy aunt in Saskatchewan. And she comes from Toronto, and it's how she adjusts to this woman who she just feels is so bizarre, and how she learned to love what she thought originally was unlovable, and appreciate her. And although she still drives her crazy, it's just overcoming the differences in behaviors that are unlike what you're used to, and learning to appreciate people for things you didn't necessarily think you'd appreciate them for at one time. I should say that the first book, that I talked about, West of Ireland, was just Kirkus named it in the top 100 books for independent authors in 2020, and A Town Called Forget was long-listed for the Stephen Leacock Award for Humor.
Oh, super. Well, congratulations on that. When did West of Ireland come out?
2016. Oh, no, that was A Town Called Forget. West of Ireland came out 2018.
2018, okay. All
2019, right. Sorry. I'm getting my dates mixed up.
That's 2019. Okay. No. I asked that just to make sure that it's available, because sometimes I get authors on whose book isn't even out yet, and they're promoting it. So.
Oh, no, they're both out.
Okay, so they're available and people can get them. Do you have a website that you want to give out that people can check out?
I do.
Yeah.
It is cphoff.ca.
Okay, well, that's easy enough. And are you on social media as well?
Oh, geez, no. I have a Facebook page with 38 friends. I am not very savvy in that department.
Okay.
To tell you the truth.
Well, not a problem. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing and telling us about your books. It's nice speaking with you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And best of luck.
Best of luck to you, too.